Welcome back, lesson 2, generating electricity. Please, at the top, what I've highlighted in blue, write down lesson 2, energy sources, date. You should be on page 10. The 2 or 3 statements from the spec are these. We're looking at the advantages and disadvantages of renewable energy, advantages and disadvantages of non-renewable energy, and also the reliability, carbon footprint and output, where we compare different types of power stations in the UK. Now, we've touched upon that really in the previous lesson. Look, it's in your booklet here. We did it last lesson on page 9. If you quickly go back to page 9, now what you should have found out there, you can check against your answer, look, is that at a world level, we are using 18.2 renewables and 81.8 non-renewables. That's when this booklet was produced. Now that probably changed quite dramatically over the last few years and needs to over the next 10-15 years to avoid global warming. We're told about that regularly in the news. So the first activity for you to do is this. Discuss and make your own points underneath. The need for energy security is much talked about in the press. What do you think this means? Come up with some reasons to explain why the world as a whole and the UK is on its own should have different proportions of electricity generated by different energy sources. So this is about the importance of not relying on one form of energy resource. Much like we have done in the past, we're very reliant as a country on coal, and we're going to look at the changing face of energy resources over the last 50-60 years in Britain in a moment. If we look at these newspaper articles, these are quite they're not recent, probably 10-15 years, some of these going back, but still the reasoning behind petrol strikes is due to the cost of petrol being increased due to tax or private companies increasing the cost of petrol, making it difficult for business owners to make a living. The risks of nuclear power plants, the risks being that there could be nuclear meltdown like they might have heard about in Chernobyl in the 1980s in what was the USSR, or terrorist attack on a nuclear plant. And the final one here, this isn't about Richard and Judy there on the right hand side, this is about the electricity bills that can be increased dramatically by private companies. So energy security really is about having a backup plan, a contingency. If one form of energy becomes too expensive, be it wind, coal, hydroelectric, we have others to use instead. We're now going to watch a video to explain that in more detail.
At the end of this video, you should be able to describe how the use of energy resources in the UK is changing. You should then be able to explain why scientists cannot control how different energy resources are used. So in this video, we're looking at energy resources in the UK. Now the first key point is that the UK has got abundant reserves of coal. Up until the 1950s, almost all of the electricity generated in the UK came from burning coal. Coal and coal gas were also used for almost all the heating and cooking in the UK. Now, two big changes took place, which meant that the use of coal fell sharply. In the 1950s, nuclear power came online, and by the 1980s, this produced around 20% of all the UK's electricity. In the 1970s, the UK became a major producer of oil and gas from the North Sea, and this began to replace coal for electricity generation. In fact, by 2000, as much electricity was generated from burning gas as from burning coal. Now, producing electricity by burning gas has got two major benefits over using coal. Firstly, burning gas generates less carbon dioxide than burning coal, and that contributes less to climate change. Secondly, gas-fired power stations are flexible. They can be switched on quickly during periods of high demand. Scientists call that a short startup time. On the other hand, coal-fired power stations have a very long startup time. Now, over the last few years, we've seen a major shift towards renewable power. We're going to look at that now. In the 1970s, scientists began to realize that carbon dioxide emissions from human activity could be leading to climate change. Unfortunately, at the time, politicians did not really see that as a big issue. The problem was that energy from fossil fuels was very cheap. We call that an economic factor. Switching away from fossil fuels costs money, and that could cost jobs. Over the following decades, scientists continued collecting data on climate change, and they continued warning politicians that they needed to take action. Gradually, politicians began to take climate change seriously, and in 2005 a large number of nations signed up to the Kyoto Protocol and committed themselves to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, what that means is that the UK has got to get serious about generating electricity from renewable resources, and actually we're in a really good position to do that. The UK has got one of the best locations for wind power in the world. Over the last decade, the UK has opened a large number of wind farms, such as the one I'm showing you here. Wind now accounts for around 11% of the UK's electricity, and that number is set to rise even further. Other renewables are also rapidly increasing, including solar power and biofuels. Now, as we said in a previous video, there is a problem with renewables, and that's reliability. For example, wind speeds can vary, and that affects the amount of electricity generated. Now, we can address that problem in two ways. First, we need a base load. In other words, a constant supply of electricity that's on all the time. Nuclear power is ideal for this. That's because nuclear power stations cannot easily be turned on and off. They tend to be left on all the time. Also, remember that nuclear power does not generate any greenhouse gases. Now, the UK government has given the go-ahead for a number of new nuclear power plants to be built in the UK, and these will provide a great deal of electricity in the future. Secondly, we can use gas-fired power stations to provide emergency power in times of peak demand. As we said, the startup time for gas-fired power stations is very short, so they can be switched on quickly, providing extra electricity when needed. So in the future, we'll have renewables providing the bulk of our electricity, with nuclear providing a base load, and then gas providing electricity during periods of peak demand. Okay, so hopefully now you should be able to describe how the uses of energy resources in the UK is changing. You should then be able to explain why.
The last part there shows the mix of different energies, and that's what today's lesson is really about. And what I want you to do now then, underneath here, is this. Come up with some reasons to explain why the world as a whole and the UK on its own should have different proportions of electricity generated by different energy sources. So pause the video and write down your reasons here. When you've completed that, press play. Right, when you've completed that, then there's one main activity for today, and that's comparing the different ways of generating electricity, solar, wind, nuclear, and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of each. You'll be given a handout, a cut and paste activity to match the advantages and disadvantages of each from the handout and stick it in your book. So, what have you been asked to do? It says, in this next section, we will look at the energy generation from different energy sources. You will focus on the advantages and disadvantages of each energy type. This can be completed on the internet and or handout 1.2a, which is a cut and paste exercise. Any other information, diagram to help in your understanding of how the different energy sources generate electricity can be included in your work. So what are you doing then? Turn it over to page 11, and it also spans over onto page 12, which will be the end of the lesson. You use your handout, and this is what your handout looks like. It's got two parts. It's got the advantages and disadvantages. And you need to match up those advantages and disadvantages to look something like this. Now, this is just an example of how you could start off. So you cut out, say, that red box there, and you'd paste that next to fossil fuels. So an advantage of fossil fuels is that large amounts of electricity can be generated cheaply. Fossil fuel power stations are very reliable. There is security of the supply of fossil fuels. And that's it for this lesson. But what I want to do now is just draw your attention before you start that activity to moving from a global level down to a local level. Here we are, like here's Pontedilai School. You can work out, perhaps if I zoom out, where you live from there. And over the last few years, 10, 15 years, in our locality, there are other ways of generating electricity different from fossil fuels, such as wind farms and solar farms with solar cells in them. So as I zoom out, and you can see right in the middle of the screen there, so we've gone up Pontedilai Mountain or Bont Mountain, and that's Clew Reservoir. And if you go north of Clew Reservoir, what you can see here, if we zoom in, you can see that wind farm. You can see the shadow. It's difficult to actually see the wind turbines, but obviously this was taken on a sunny day, and you can see the shadow of those huge wind turbines. So there's a wind farm just north of Pontedilai, and if we go past Clew Reservoir to the south of Clew Reservoir, I'm sure around here there are solar farms. So here we go, look, you can see what we're looking at here are hundreds and thousands of solar cells which are able to convert the sun's light energy into electrical energy. So there's your starter for 10. You can pause the video and use that to help. But to support you complete this task, what we're going to do is look at various videos, starting off with we'll start off with nuclear power, and then you go back and complete the advantages and disadvantages for nuclear energy. Okay, here's the free science lessons video. Sean, excellent at explaining, and he's going to explain all the advantages and disadvantages of nuclear power. We'll then press pause, or you'll press pause on the video, complete nuclear energy before we do the others. So make a note of the advantages and disadvantages and match it up to your cutouts.
I'm showing you here a nuclear power plant in England. Now, the first key idea about nuclear power is that it's non-renewable. Nuclear power plants run on the elements uranium and plutonium. Let's take a look at the advantages of generating electricity by nuclear power. The first advantage is that once a nuclear power plant is running, it does not release carbon dioxide. That means that nuclear power does not contribute to climate change. Here's the second advantage. Nuclear power is extremely reliable. It generates a lot of electricity exactly when we want it. Now, there are some disadvantages to nuclear power. The first is that nuclear power plants contain highly dangerous radioactive materials. Now, that means that if there's an accident, then these materials can be released into the environment. That could be potentially disastrous. I'm showing you here a Japanese nuclear power plant. In 2011, a tsunami flooded the power plant, and that caused the release of radioactive material. Over 150,000 people who lived nearby had to be evacuated, and the cleanup will continue for many years. Here's a second disadvantage. At the end of its life, a nuclear power plant has to be decommissioned or dismantled. That takes many years and it's extremely expensive. Here's the third disadvantage. During its life and after decommissioning, a nuclear power plant generates large amounts of highly dangerous radioactive waste. That waste has to be stored for thousands of years before it's safe. Now, in the next video, we're going to be exploring how different power plants, including nuclear, will contribute to the UK's energy use.
So that's your helping hand then for nuclear energy. Select, cut out, and put, before you paste in, just put the next nuclear energy, and then we can confirm everything at the end before you paste all your answers in. Next then, we have got fossil fuels. Now remember, fossil fuels are non-renewable. Once they're used, they can't be replaced. And nuclear energy comes into that bracket of non-renewable.
I'm showing you here the three main fossil fuels. We've got coal, oil, and gas. Now, fossil fuels supply around 80% of the world's total energy needs, and that's because they've got a number of advantages. Here's the first advantage. Fossil fuels are reliable. In other words, they always provide energy when we need it. Now, that's a huge advantage when compared with other sources of energy, for example, renewable sources. Here's the second advantage. Fossil fuels release a great deal of energy. That makes them extremely useful, for example, in aeroplanes. Aeroplanes can fly for thousands of miles before refueling, and that's because jet fuel, which is made from oil, can provide a huge amount of energy. Here's a third advantage. Fossil fuels are abundant. In other words, the world still has plenty of coal, plenty of oil, and plenty of gas. That makes fossil fuels relatively cheap. Here's the final advantage of generating energy from fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are extremely versatile. In other words, we can use them for transport, generating electricity, and for heating. One of the reasons for this is that they're portable, which means that they're very useful, for example, to power vehicles. Not all sources of energy are as versatile as fossil fuels, in particular the renewable sources. Now, there are some major disadvantages to using fossil fuels for energy. Here's the first disadvantage. Burning fossil fuels releases a huge amount of carbon dioxide, and that's contributing to climate change. We're going to be discussing that in a later video when we look at how energy use in the UK is changing. Here's the second disadvantage. Fossil fuels are non-renewable. Now, that means that they're not being replenished or replaced as we use them. So fossil fuels will one day run out. Now, that's not going to be for a very long time, but it will eventually happen if we continue to use them. The third disadvantage of using fossil fuels for energy is that they can release other pollutants. For example, burning diesel in cars and lorries releases carbon particles and nitrogen oxides. We now know that both of these are extremely dangerous to human health. Burning coal can produce sulfur dioxide, which leads to acid rain, and this damages buildings and trees. In the next video, we're going to look at renewable sources of energy.
We are going to look at renewable sources of energy, but before that, again, you can pause the video. There's your helping hand for fossil fuel advantages, and you need to select the disadvantages for fossil fuels. Once you've done that, press play. The third and final video then is renewable.
There are lots of different types of renewable energy resources. Wind power, solar power, and hydroelectric power are all commonly used around the world. We've also got tidal power, biofuels, geothermal, and wave power. we're going to evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of each of these forms of renewable energy. So let's start by looking at the two main advantages shared by all types of renewable energy resources. Firstly, they'll never run out, and that's because they're renewable, so they're constantly being replenished. The second big advantage of renewable energy resources is that once they're in place, they do not add any carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, so they do not contribute to climate change. Now, there are some disadvantages to renewable energy. Wind power and solar power are not reliable. Some days are simply not windy, and solar power does not work well on cloudy days. So we cannot rely on solar or wind power to provide all of the UK's energy needs. Now, unlike wind and solar power, hydroelectric power is very reliable. However, habitats are destroyed when dams are built and valleys are flooded. Also, hydroelectricity is only really useful in countries which have got lots of rivers, so it's not really suitable for the United Kingdom. Now, tidal power is extremely reliable. We know that the tide will come in and go out twice a day. At the moment, the UK does not generate any electricity from tidal power. However, there are proposals to build a tidal barrage across the Severn Estuary, but some people argue that this would be harmful to wildlife. Now, wave power is reliable and has huge potential in the UK, which has got an extensive coastline. However, at this stage, wave power is very small scale and experimental. Geothermal energy uses heat from the earth to generate electricity and heat buildings. This is reliable, but it's not really used very much in the United Kingdom. Now, there's one point about all of the renewable resources that we've looked at so far. They all generate electricity. Now, that's potentially a problem, and that's because a lot of energy used in the UK is for transport, including cars. Almost all cars in the UK run on petrol or diesel, and they're fossil fuels. Now, that will change in the future as electric cars become more affordable, but for the moment it does present a problem. That leads us to our final renewable resource, which is biofuel. Biofuels are produced from plant materials. Now, when we burn biofuels, we release carbon dioxide. However, the growing plants took in carbon dioxide, so we're not adding any extra carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Scientists call this carbon neutral. Biofuels are potentially very useful as we can use them to power vehicles such as cars and buses. There is a problem with biofuels. If we use land to grow crops for fuel, that could push up the price of food. Remember that you'll find plenty of questions on renewable energy resources in...
Okay, so that was your third and final. What you need to do now then is decide which box, which cut-out box goes where, and when you've decided, before you paste in, press play. So pause now. Okay, here are the advantages for fossil, wind, hydroelectric, biofuels. Pause as needed. Advantages here for nuclear, solar, hydroelectric and geothermal. Disadvantages. Pause again as needed. And the fourth and final slide to help you. Once you've paused on each of those and you've checked your answers, paste in your final answers, checking against the paused slides on your screen. And that concludes lesson 2 for generating electricity, and it takes us down to the bottom of page 12. See you next time. Bye.